which is called College UnMazed, your guide to design and document your homeschool experience. So they are going to be sharing about their new curriculum and book and what that all entails and why they wrote it and all the need for such a book. And so one of the things to pay attention to, if you do have questions, we are going to be answering them throughout this webinar. So please do use the chat, put in your information. You might want to say hi, maybe tell us where you're from, if you're a parent, if you're an IEC, kind of what your role is in helping homeschool families. And so just a little bit before they get started in their presentation, like I said, I'm Dr. Stirk, and we are College UnMazed is a series of educators and researchers that are really dedicated to helping parents and students navigate the high school to college process. So I started helping my own students and through the process and realized that we needed more of a curriculums, a book or a guide to really how to kind of make informed decisions throughout a student's educational journey. So originally, I partnered with Dr. Tim Poynton and Dr. Rich LePan, and we created the first College UnMazed student workbook, which really it goes from 9th grade to building your college and career readiness skills, all the way through something called the LEAD strategy, which is building your college list, exploring colleges, applying, deciding, and succeeding. And then what we started to do is realize there are little kind of niches out there that a lot of families needed additional information. So we added a parent guide to help families kind of navigate that process. Then Dr. Sarah Stashkew and I wrote a book on the guide to dual enrollment, something I'm really passionate about. And I know a lot of the homeschool families really love dual enrollment for a lot of different reasons. And I was excited enough to meet Holly a while ago. She came on a presentation for me that I was presenting with Dr. Poynton. And she goes, I love homeschool. This is what I've been doing. And could there be possibly a homeschool book, a homeschool companion to all of the curriculum that we already have? And I said, absolutely. And that is how we started this process and are now releasing kind of the 4th book in the series, which is specifically designed to help those homeschool families through this process. So really excited again for this book and all of the stuff that you have been doing, and you are going to be in for a treat today. So let's get started here, and let's go on to Michelle. Why don't you introduce yourself first?
Sure. I'm Dr. Michelle Ivard, and I think like a lot of educational consultants and a lot of homeschooling families, I've done a lot of things over the years. The most important thing here is that I'm a lifelong learner. I study how people learn. I love to talk about different options, and it really helps me connect with kids as well as they are learning. I was just really honored when Holly said, hey, shall we write this book together? Couldn't have had a better co-author. Holly?
Well, thanks for that. And yeah, this has been just a dream year working with Michelle and with you, Amanda, getting this book together. So hi, everybody. I'm Holly Ramsey. Like Michelle, I'm a longtime home educator. In fact, spent all of the 21st century up until 2021 home educating my own 5 children. And in addition to that, I've just always been involved in education my entire adult life. So I had the good fortune to land at Chapel Hill when they were becoming the National Paideia Center. So got some really great training in my grad program, followed that up with working in a Coalition of Essential Schools program within a public school. And then finally, in some recent years, I've been working at Brave Writer, which I did for 6 years, where I got the opportunity to teach online and taught hundreds of homeschoolers, helped improve their writing skills. So that's a little bit about me, but what we want to do is really share with you guys what we hope to accomplish in this probably right around an hour that we have with you. So we understand we're talking to actually a couple different audiences here today. We know there are a lot of educational consultants on this webinar call in particular, and thank you. Shout out to our colleagues. Thanks for coming to support us, and we hope you learned something. We think you will during this hour. We want to also speak to the homeschool parents who are here. This book is really our love letter to the homeschooling families, and also to our educational consultants who maybe don't know a whole lot about homeschooling. So we hope by the end of the hour, you'll have some really practical tips. We want this to be an inside view into our book. The graphics you'll see are actual graphics from our book, so you can see just how amazing Amanda Stirk is as a publisher. She made our book look incredible. We're going to talk about ways to not only design your homeschool, but to document it. So when we thought about this book, we knew there was a need. And most of you probably realized during the pandemic, homeschooling numbers went through the roof. We were all homeschoolers there for a time, and a lot came away with not such a great view of it, because pandemic schooling is very different from homeschooling. But what we found, and what the Washington Post has documented for us, is that the numbers stayed elevated. So the numbers aren't as high as they were necessarily at the peak of the pandemic, but a large number of homeschooling families stuck around. And so educational consultants are seeing more homeschoolers in their practice, and homeschooling families are realizing, just the fact that I homeschool does not necessarily make me unique in the college admission process. So just to give you a sense, whatever you think you know about homeschoolers probably is too narrow, because this increase we have seen has cut across every demographic group and every geographic group. So, for example, the Washington Post found that Little Anderson, South Carolina, homeschooling grew 373% in 6 years. They also found school district in the Bronx, 358% increase in homeschooling. So this really does cross all boundaries. And it's hard to get a true read on the number of homeschoolers. Not all states require reporting. But the best guess estimates tell us that there's somewhere between 1.9 million to as many as 2.3 million homeschoolers is sort of a best guess number. By way of comparison, that's more than the number of students who are in Catholic parochial schools in their K-12 education. So it is here. There's a lot of us, and we just really recognized that most of these homeschoolers do not have institutional support. They are doing this on their own by and large, and there is a real need for them to have accurate information, up-to-date information. And so we figured we would go ahead and put that in a form that people could use. And Michelle, I think you were going to kind of talk a little bit about that form.
Absolutely. The crisis of confidence, as we put down on the last bullet here, is really significant. Even for somebody who's studied education, has all the degree, you get to your oldest kid is 8th grade, and all of a sudden you realize everything you do has to be documented in a way that the colleges can understand it. You not only are making all the decisions, you have to talk about the decisions. So actually in the college application process, we talk about how much students have to write. Welcome to how much the homeschooling parent has to write. So if you want to advance to the next slide, one of the key things we knew that needed to happen for the book is on the right side, how to document the homeschooling experience. So this mind map that's available on the website is really the structure of the book. The first half is how to design your homeschool. The second half is how to document it, right? So we go through, how do you think about what you're doing? How do you design it so that it's going to work for state regulations, for college applications, that you cover the necessary material, but in creative ways that work for your family? How do you make grades? And then we go on to the documentation process. How do you make a transcript that colleges will understand and be accurate, be appropriate? How do you do the course descriptions, the school profile, and the counselor letter? So this gives you an overview of how the book is structured. But as Amanda said, and Holly said, we're going to go through and give you sneak peeks at some of the actual graphics in the book and how we put this together.
Yeah, so I saw on our call, we have Lisa Relags on our call, and she has actually a quote that I just love about this, beginning to think about your homeschool journey. And she has a phrase that parents feel this looming sense of critique. And that does weigh heavy. And so, you got all these questions kind of coming at you from outside people. When you choose to homeschool, people are curious. Sometimes that comes from a genuine place, and sometimes it doesn't. So a lot of times the questions can feel intimidating if you haven't thought about what your own goals are. So right from the start in chapter 1, we invite parents to kind of tune out that noise, all those questions that are coming from the outside, and really focus on your own goals for homeschooling. And you're homeschooling a whole person. So you have a lot of considerations to think about. Sometimes when parents start homeschooling, it is a positive choice. They knew from the time their kid was 2 years old, this is what they were going to do. And they have, a dissertation on each one of these considerations, what their goals are for every one of these categories. Other times, people come to homeschooling from a very wounded position. Maybe they have felt pushed out of an institutional school for one reason or another. So in the very first step, we offer you some tools and exercises, particularly perhaps if you're coming at it from a negative push, on how to pause, think about that, and reframe for what your own goals actually are. Because not that and pointing toward some negatives that you've experienced is not a sustaining philosophy. You will not be able to joyfully homeschool through high school if you're approaching it only for negative reasons. So along with those goals and those questions comes sort of the elephant in the room. We all hear it. If you're a homeschooler, you've heard it. If you're an IEC, you've probably thought it. What about socialization? So you can go on to that next slide, please, Amanda. So homeschoolers know that this is a myth, but what you need to be aware of in the college admission process is that this stereotype does live on. And you may encounter admission professionals who do have a big question mark as they read your application about what about socialization? So in our book, we just encourage you, to think about this very broadly in terms of your goals. There's lots of different ways you can get group access, and homeschoolers know this, but be mindful of it, because as you're noting these things, these groups are probably going to crop back up as you circle around to doing your documentation. Michelle, do you want to go on and talk a little bit maybe about some of the philosophy behind goals?
Absolutely. The one thing that all homeschoolers have in common is that the system didn't work at some point for somebody in their family, right? Everything else is just as unique as each family is. So go ahead to the next slide. One of the things that we know as parents, when you have a baby, a parent, a guardian, a baby's learning all the time, and you make faces and they make faces. You say words, they eventually learn words that you can understand. So we naturally have this learning, mentoring experience with our children. When it comes to now I'm teaching, or now it's high school time, we have to think about how we're going to convey material, or how the student is going to learn the material, which is really more important than how it's conveyed. So when we're working on designing our homeschool, and when you are, we invite you to think about what are the primary ways that education is conducted? What is the language that educators understand so that the college admissions people will understand what you're doing? For you, it may be just natural. You've lived with this child. You know how to know whether they've learned something or not, but admissions officers don't. So using their language really helps. The 3 categories of teacher-directed education, learner-centered or child-centered teaching and learning, and self-directed learning, because in homeschooling, we've got that opportunity. In college, we call it independent study. In homeschooling, we call it learning. Right? So there's all these different kinds of philosophies you can explore, but one of the helpful things when you are jotting down at the beginning of how do you think your student learns, this child, what works best for them, and it can be different for different subjects, and that's okay. That's absolutely a strength of homeschooling, is that you can approach different topics in different ways. So thinking about the rules, though, is really important. Holly, do you want to talk about the states?
Yeah, I think I'll just add a little bit to what you were saying before about those 3 modes. I think something that you and I probably would agree we've seen a lot is there's sort of a natural stage of growth to a home educator. And very often when someone is beginning their homeschooling journey, their first question is, what in the box curriculum can I buy that's going to fit every subject? And sometimes that's because that feels comfortable to them. That's an okay place to start. And some people stay there and it works well for their families. I would say very often what I see is sort of a natural progression toward trusting their own instincts more, incorporating their own students' desires more, and trusting their student is learning. Sometimes I think parents can be a little fearful that if it's not painful and comes with a thick book spine, then it doesn't count as a class. And that's absolutely not true. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Similarly, sometimes I think when IECs, independent consultants, encounter a homeschooler or somebody questioning that, they automatically think online school. And there's just such a richer world available to people. But you can't ignore your state regulations. So that's always the first stop when you're planning, like find out what the laws in your state are. And we're talking about homeschooling here as if it is one thing. Homeschooling is not one thing, and not legally, not how anybody practices it. Some states are very highly regulated. Some states have practically no regulations. So you really need to make sure where you are that you are understanding what your state laws are. And there are, ICHER is a great resource that has some of the homeschooling regulations. There's a new hub through Johns Hopkins that has some of the homeschooling regulations. So there's places you can learn about that. Most states have a state homeschool group of one form or another that could help you with that. But something to note is not all states dictate graduation requirements. So as a homeschooler, sometimes it's surprising that you also get to set your graduation requirements. And doing so while ignoring what public schools have to do maybe isn't your best bet, right? So take a glance at what those institutional schools are requiring for graduation. Even if you have choice, it's a good idea to be informed about what 97% of the population is doing. Those are the people who are going to be applying to colleges with you. So I think that's, we're not going to speak to every state individually, but if anybody needs a little bit of help finding the regulations in their state, feel free to reach out to us and we'll be happy to help you with that. And then as you design, Michelle, could you talk a little bit about just sort of what that looks like in the breadth and scope of classes people might choose to offer?
Absolutely. So Holly mentioned the different states are different, but inside states, it can be different. Here in Massachusetts, there is no statewide graduation requirement. It is set by the local school district. So it really, really can vary. And in the book, we've given a resource to the 50 state comparison charts that are maintained. I'll make sure we get it into the chat, that help find that kind of information out. That's a governmental thing for education in general, not just for homeschooling, but it could be super helpful for us to refer to. As most of us know, there are what are called core subjects in high school. You've got the math, science, English language arts, social studies, and languages other than English. Those form the basis of the high school education. Of course, there's options for electives, there's music and arts, there's physical education and health. But the core subjects that often are done in every year are these. We like to give examples. It doesn't have to be US history and world history. Yes, those are important, and most students in the US take US history, if not all. But you can also do economics, you can do psychology. What your student is interested in is an option in the social studies category. One of the fun things I learned while doing this is some of the fun options for English language arts and for social studies that the state of Tennessee maintains on their educational website. Some wild things that were just really exciting, and I wanted to go back to school. Parents don't always know that, your local graduation requirement might be 2 years of math or 2 years of a language other than English. When you look at what colleges want, it can be different, very different. So one example that we liked is Florida State University lists not just what their requirements are, but what the average student who successfully applied to them has done. And it's more than 4 credits of math. It's kind of a wake-up call for a lot of people. Not to say you have to do dozens in every one, but to understand that the minimum and what will get the student into a competitive engineering program or a nursing program can be different. It's really important to know in the planning stages. So Holly, I think you we're going to go on to the next one. This is actually for me. Thinking about what kind of studying you do that's beyond just the core standard defined high school classes. Community art centers, museums have lots of programs that they invite students into. Sometimes a parent will look at it and go, yeah, but is it really a class? It doesn't have to be taken at an institution to be something that you can look at, a standard syllabus to see. Sometimes we go to a college catalog. Actually, I go to Google and say, what college has a class on this? A student that I worked with had been on bed rest for a long time. And I said, what did you do? Oh, sometimes I couldn't watch documentaries even, so I watched comedy. So I said, oh, what have you watched? She starts chatting. We get in the discussion. She's like, do you know the Brady Bunch and that 70s show are about the same time period, but they were written at different times and they are different and she starts talking. And I start Googling. There's classes in sitcoms. There's classes in science fiction. There's all kinds of things. So sometimes what a student is doing, a person is doing just to learn what they enjoy can also be put down into a format that colleges are going to understand. Whether it's an official continuing ed program, a certification, apprenticeship, there are lots of options for ways that students can learn things. You want to go on to the next one?
Yeah, so here we just put together just a sample, and we really wanted to emphasize this is just a sample. This is one way of about, 80 million that you could design a homeschool curriculum. And what we want to get across, if you've spent any time on homeschool chat boards, something I see kind of frequently is, I don't think my kid is college bound, but da, 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 da. And there's a question. So something I would just always want to encourage all homeschooling parents is life is long, plans can change. And regardless of whether you think your kid's going to wind up at a 4-year institution, every kid deserves a college prep education. So our independent consultants on the call are going to know that taking all 5 core subjects, all 4 years of high school is going to keep the most number of doors open. But there's a lot of ways you can fulfill that goal. So for example, I think many people choose homeschooling because it is a humane path. And sometimes people who have been leading with kindness and really focusing on the child freak out in high school and feel like they have to force their kid into a mold. If you don't have a mathy kid, you're maybe never going to have a mathy kid. But that doesn't mean that that child can't progress in math and can't take math all 4 years of high school. Just like institutional schools have levels of most of their classes where there's most rigorous, and then there's some that just sort of meet the requirements. You have the option to do that. So I would just encourage parents to tinker. You absolutely can modify any plan to meet your learner. But to say that someone is not college bound, it hurts all of our hearts a little bit, even though there's plenty of, not everyone needs to go to college. There's many valid ways, but let's not close doors on a 15, 16-year-old kid. Let's leave all the doors open. And so this is one way you could design a 4-year course of study that would keep that open. So once you have this broad idea, sort of the 5x4 plus some electives every year, how in the world, Michelle, do we go about designing it?
Absolutely. I will say, just because you bring up math as an example, I was a mathy kid. I loved math. One of my majors, one of my degrees is in math. My sophomore, was it my junior year of college, I got a professor who said, okay, everything you've done before is just manipulation of numbers. That's arithmetic. Now you're going to do real math. So there's lots of kinds of math that are absolutely valid, not just statistics, not just the path to calculus. You can do logic, personal finance. How many of us have thought, oh my word, I could have learned something useful in high school and learned how to balance my checkbook, right? Lots of things to do. But developing and designing your courses can feel, a little bit intimidating. It's, like Holly said, sometimes really tempting just to grab a whole curriculum, say, hey, that's a company, they've put out textbooks, they must know what they're doing. Great, I'm going to get those. Doesn't always work for every kid. Might work for some subjects, not work for other subjects. That's okay. Whether a kid is way ahead in something or not as far as they would like to be for the standard age guidelines for when we learn what. A lot of flexibility is really one of the strengths of homeschooling. So planning something advanced, getting yourself a book, saying, okay, we're going to go through, there's 9 chapters, 9 months in the year. This is what we're going to do. Hope that we get through it, kind of like high school, kind of a real institutional school will do. Great, you can do that. You can also do flexible planning. Say, hey, well, we can try Khan Academy or this textbook, see which one fits my kid better, and go along. Right? You can say, US history, we're going to do revolutions and the establishment of the country, and then let's see what you want to do for second semester. We get somewhere that you're like, wow, what happened there? Why is that called the French and Indian War? Great. You want to go in depth? Let's do it. You want to go for civil rights for the last 400 years. You want to go women's history since 1950s. There are options, and flexible planning lets you do that. Organic development is what we're using to say, sometimes people just like to learn something, and it's not defined as a course in advance, like my student who was watching the comedies. And you can say in advance, you're just learning. Later, you can say, wow, I could actually document that in a form that works. Allowing a student to develop at their own pace is beautiful. I mean, think about, go back to our example of kids learning to walk or to talk. We don't all learn the same words in the same order at the same day of the same month of age. We don't have to learn math at the same time. You can take 2 months, you can take 2 years. If you cover geometry, you cover geometry. So if you want to go to the next slide, there's lots and lots of ways that you can get course support beyond just creating it yourself or having your student create it. Yes, there's the books and traditional textbooks, also homeschool groups, cooperatives. I've led a variety of things, and my kids learned things from a lot of other people who did things that maybe I could have done, but I didn't, because that what didn't work for my kid at that moment. But it's great to collaborate with other people. There's also, look, with the pandemic, there's so many more things available now. Museums were putting all kinds of things online. Artists were drawing and sharing, giving lessons. And since they created it, they've kept it. So there's all kinds of audio, video, print media out there, connecting to tutors, connecting to mentors, whether it's somebody who's an official tutor or not. It's just, there's so many options to think about that it can be overwhelming, but it's just a plethora of options. If you want to go to the next slide, we're talking about applying to college. So recording the things that you do, especially when we're talking about non-traditional ways of learning or organic growth, what do I need to keep? Always a challenge, right? Thank goodness for digital photography. Instead of having to print all those photos and keep all the stacks of papers, right? My Google Drive, that saves me. But keeping records, a lot of things like YouTube, keep your history, or your students' history. Can't remember how many times my kids came to me, whether they were 3 and saying, "Mommy, do you know how to make chartreuse?" Thank you, Blue's Clues. No, I did not. There's records of all of these things in a lot of the documents. When they were teenagers, they were following neuroscientists. Who knew? Authors have YouTube. So keeping track of those kinds of things, and especially here, feedback from others. Sometimes somebody will tell a homeschooling parent, "Hey, did you know your kid did this?" Or "It was really wonderful when they did that." Keeping that information helps you in your records when you now need to talk about your kids to somebody else. Now, Holly, you had some great options for how to make those assessments and some opinions about grades. Do you want to share that?
Yeah, I do have some strong opinions about grades and homeschoolers, most of which, probably my greatest opinion is that grading is not particularly relevant to homeschoolers in a home situation, but colleges expect grades. So I think a lot of times parents become hung up on how to give grades to their students. And again, if you're using a traditional program or you have a lot of outside providers, this may not be an issue for you because they may handle the grading for you and you've sort of offloaded the grading. But for your home created courses, you've got to decide how to assign a grade. So one thing I think you should keep in mind is that grades are really useful to institutional schools that have to sort a large number of students. When a teacher has a student load of 100 kids over the course of a day and needs a quick way to evaluate them. As a home educator, I think most parents are much more in tune on a daily basis and intuitively with what their kids know and don't know, because you're talking about it with them. So yes, you may be giving them a math quiz, but you're also probably talking about political events around your kitchen table. So I really think that it's best to view grades sort of as a necessary evil. And keep in mind how schools do it. Schools do not do their grades usually based just on quizzes or tests. So as a home educator, I would encourage parents not to do their grades just based on quizzes and tests. Oral discussion is a valid evaluation method. And if your kid can demonstrate with nuanced reasons why they think something, learn something, that's an A. You may want to pair that with some writing. Do they have to have dissertation level writing for it to be an A? No, they don't. But they need to show progress. And parents just, I think, sometimes err on the side, sometimes of being too harsh in their grades with their homeschoolers, in a fear that they have to look tough so that these mommy grades will hold up. And I just would encourage you that what you are doing is enough. Who you are as a home educator is enough. And in high school, you are going to have multiple opportunities to layer in other forms of assessment. So the funnel becomes broader in high school. Your students, hopefully, will have some outside instructors that are also probably going to be corroborating what you see in the home. Those students may be doing apprenticeships that are also speaking in. They may do a research project. So there's lots of ways you can arrive at a grade, but if your kid is meeting your expectations and doing what they should do and demonstrating that they're with it, it's okay to give that child an A. And you can see some of the ways we've listed below to things that potentially could be graded, which sort of, Michelle, you're looking like you want to add in. You have a point? Go
I've
ahead.
just got to add in, absolutely. I had a friend when her oldest kid was in 8th grade said, there's no way I can homeschool for high school. I said, why not? Because the highest grade I could ever give my kids is C. I said, what? Well, C is meets expectations, and I expect that they always do their best. This is not the way we recommend grading, right? Meets expectations is not a C. I was blessed to have twins, and one chose to go to our public high school freshman year. And I saw what got an A in an honors English class, and was able to compare it to my other daughter. You don't have to have twins to be able to successfully homeschool or help homeschooling families, but don't hold them to dissertation standards, as Holly said. And by the way, there was oral assessment when I was doing my dissertation. That's what that whole oral exams and defense are. So it's absolutely legitimate, just as Holly said.
Yeah.
Holly, I know you've got the transcripts. Go ahead.
Very often homeschoolers teach to mastery. So lots of homeschoolers, you don't go on until you have demonstrated that you really know this. Well, that's going to lead to probably pretty high grades in some instances because you are not moving on till you know it. So one thing, the grading for an individual class, and then you've got to roll this up into a transcript, right? So homeschoolers, again, they become very intimidated to make transcript is just a 1-page document. You will have your grades on there. You'll have a grading scale on there, but you're going to unpack that grading scale elsewhere. And we're going to talk about the homeschool profile, which is where you can more explain your philosophy of grading. So once we're turning to the documenting side of things, there's 4 core documents for homeschoolers to prepare: the transcript, course descriptions, homeschool profile, and counselor letter. We should say right up front, not all colleges will accept all 4 of these documents. Some don't want anything other than a final transcript if you choose to attend that college, and they have you self-report your grades, and that's all they want. What we find, though, is very few, vanishingly few, homeschoolers and homeschooling families in 9th and 10th grade know exactly what colleges they are going to apply to, or know exactly what those requirements are. So we encourage parents to do their record keeping consistently throughout high school. If you have all 4 of these documents, you will be prepared to apply to any school in the country. So it's also can be hard. You think you're going to remember things and you won't remember. You think the outside teacher from 9th grade is always going to teach at that co-op, and you can always get that syllabus from her, and she will move halfway across the country. So keeping records as you go is a great practice. That said, for our delight-driven unschoolers in the crowd, sometimes you have to create your grades retrospectively and your descriptions retrospectively because you don't always know what's going to be a class. And that's fine too. Just as Michelle said earlier, just keep all your materials. You can turn it into a class or a grade later. But on your transcripts, so just running through this real quickly because I want to make sure we do have time for questions. So transcripts, what makes it official? It has to say official transcript on it. So please make sure it says official. Make sure you sign that transcript. You're going to have some basic information on your student, your address. You are going to list the classes that they took, the number of credits. It's helpful to define what a credit is in your homeschool. And for a lot of homeschoolers, they will just say 1 credit is 120 hours or 1 dual enrolled class. That's all you need on that transcript. You can unpack that and explain it further in other documents. It is helpful to have a start date in addition to a graduation date, particularly for athletes. That start date is important. So I just tell all my clients, make sure you've got a start date as well as a graduation date on there. And the other thing about transcripts, and we've got lots of samples in our book that you can take a look at and that we link to. But the one thing about transcripts is homeschoolers tend to have what I call messy transcripts because most homeschoolers are flexi-schoolers. And what that term means is that they take classes from a variety of providers, including institutional schools, sometimes the local public school, sometimes a dual enrolled class. they tend to have a lot of different providers. So one way to handle that on your homeschool transcript, in addition to having your course name and the subject it falls under, the year you took it, all that jazz, include a column which is the source of your course. So that could be taught at home. That could be community college. So if you just include that on the line with your title of your class, it's really easy for somebody to look at it at a glance and make sense of what you're doing. Admission officers don't necessarily care what you do as long as they understand it. So make it clear and easy to understand. Michelle and I probably fall a little bit on opposite sides of the, do you format by subject or do you format by year? I don't know that it makes a difference. There are certain categories of students for whom one works well, and there are certain categories of students for whom the other works well. And we go into that in the book. So feel free to get the book to go into the nitty-gritty on that. But my overall advice to you would be make it clear at a glance. And then you can back it up. And Michelle, I think you were going to tell people a little bit about course descriptions, because sometimes homeschool parents don't know what those are, and sometimes independent consultants are unaware that they're needed. Oh yes, and here's an unweighted and weighted grading scale. I always suggest weighting grades. Most colleges are going to strip off that weighting and ignore it and toss it in the trash. But guess what? Some don't. And the some that don't sometimes use it for merit awards. So I usually advise my clients to use weighted grades and report the highest ethical GPA that they can.
The one thing that makes the transcript official, it's saying official high school transcript. Signing it helps too. But as Holly said, the conveying the information is what's really important. I like to add a line in the bottom of mine that says homeschooling was done in accordance with the laws of whatever state or territory you were in, because the laws are different in different states. When it comes to course descriptions, clear, concise, and compelling wins the day. You do not want to be the family that one college admissions officer mentioned to me when I said, oh, I work with homeschoolers and help them do documents. He says, not 72 pages of course descriptions, right? Who has time to read that? He sure didn't, right? Now, we also want to not overwhelm with detail on standard things when we want those unique things to shine, right? So math is a great example. Again, you studied algebra, you used Khan Academy. How many lines do you really need, right? A couple of lines, we're done. If you did geometry like one of my students did, hands-on, was actually working in a children's theater, doing all the set design, costume design, managing the budget. I mean, laying out pattern pieces. You want to talk about using geometry, right? So the parent said, wow, my kid didn't actually study geometry, but they know so much about it. We went to the standards for math. States love to lay out standards. We went through the standards of their state with the kid. The kid's like, yep. What's that? Spent a little time, learned those couple of things, and was done with geometry. That took more explanation, right? So when you're doing a description, don't spend as much time on every single class, or as much space, when you want those unique things to really stand out. We've got a lot of examples in the book of different course descriptions. So I don't think we need to go into depth. But know that having that key information, sometimes it's, this was in person, this was with a mentor, this was with other live students, is really helpful, right? Those are some, again, ways of bucking the socialization myth and showing that your student is ready to work in the college environment. One thing homeschoolers have actually as an advantage, the kid who has managed their own time, who has advocated for themselves, who has done a class that only meets once or twice a week and has had a lot of quote unquote free time to manage themselves, has worked in an environment much more like college than somebody who's been in a traditional high school and their time has been managed from 8 to 3. And then they try to do their afternoon activities and then they try to smash in the homework for tomorrow, right? So We can use the course descriptions in a concise way to help highlight where a student has had advocacy, where they can show their readiness for the next steps. So, Holly, you mentioned before about the philosophy, and the homeschool profile is where it can shine.
Yeah, for sure. So this is a document that sometimes catches families by surprise. They're unaware that it's helpful to include a homeschool profile. When you think about it, a homeschool profile, it has one goal, and that is to provide context. So colleges are going to know a lot about an applicant and who they are just by their zip code. And they pay enrollment consultants big money to get that information. What they have no idea about is what homeschool options are available in your local area. They truly don't know that. So the homeschool profile is a great place to kind of lay out the homeschool demographics. What's the sea that you swim in? What are the opportunities that are there? Or what are the limitations in things that are not present? So you might want to, either in the homeschool profile or in the counselor letter, kind of sketch that, because admission readers know local high schools well. They do not know the local homeschooling scene well. All those reasons we discussed early in the webinar for your goals for homeschooling and how to think about that, that gets translated into your homeschool profile in your philosophy section. So it's good to put in that time up front. Even if you have negative push factors, I would say when you write your homeschool profile, translate that into a positive pull sort of factor. So plenty of people leave school because of something negative, but there's always a flip side to that. So we began home educating to teach my child at an appropriate level for them and to ensure, positive social interactions, whatever. Translation, my kid was bullied. So there's always a positive way to frame it. And I would encourage parents to do that. In the homeschool profile, that's where you're going to unpack your grading scale. And again, if you've had tons of providers, you probably are dealing with multiple grading scales. So you can explain not only how you graded in the home, but give the grading scales for all these multiple providers you may have. And then finally, in the homeschool profile, that is an excellent place to spotlight your educational partners and providers. So course description is about a class. Educational partners is about these particularly homeschool entities that you may have brought in. So if your kid did classes with Online G3, I see Jamie's in our audience today. So if you took an online class with Jamie's wonderful organization, you want to tell people, what is Online G3? And, lo and behold, we have an example in our book right from Jamie of, a few lines of how you can describe that organization. It's brief, a few lines. You're just putting this in context. And the goal of all this is to get colleges to realize, oh, hey, they did have rigor. Wow. So it's another way for parents who may still feel a little bit of that mommy grade anxiety. It's another way to demonstrate, like, hey, we're legit. Look at this. We use some really excellent sources to give a education with depth and rigor and joy and delight. That's the purpose of the homeschool profile. But you're not done yet. You still have to write a counselor letter. What? Michelle, how are they going to do that?
With a lot of emotion. I tell parents, yes, this is like your capstone project. This is the moment when you try to write an essay, as it were, about how this young person, this that you raised, is now a young adult and they're ready for the next steps. I've had parents tell me, oh yeah, I've been in tears over this. I've had parents start with, oh, when they were a baby, we played this and we listen to that, and great. Write out all those beautiful memories you have. This is going to be a keepsake for you, and then set it aside and write a counselor letter. The function of this is like a FAQ. You've got somebody reading your kid's application, and they read the transcript, and they read the school profile, the homeschool profile that you've created, the course descriptions, and they're like, but why did this kid study that? Or what did they mean by this? Or, there was a dip in grades there. Why? Your school counselor would answer those questions in the counselor letter, and so can you. Sometimes people are saying, well, are they really going to read a mommy counselor letter? Because of course mommy thinks kid is ready. Yes, they're going to read this, but you're going to write it in a way that they're going to understand. They know your parent. They know that there's some emotion there. But if you can keep to why you have done this, what your kid has learned, the personal growth they've done, strengths they've had, maybe ways they've overcome challenges, it can be a real advantage to provide a demonstration of how your kid is ready for college. And remember, we said keep those records of all those different things, including quotes from anybody your kid has worked with. You can bring those right into the counselor letter. Not only in my words, it's show, not tell, right? I can say my kid works well with others, but I can say this mentor said, quote, you're blah, 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 about my kid. It's stronger, absolutely stronger. If you want to go to the next one, this is not a dissertation. This is 1, maybe 2 pages, right? Concise is important, easy to read. We've got a couple of links in our book to like Rick Clark and a couple of other people who say, admissions professionals, bullet lists, bullet points are okay. Make it easy to read, right? You want this to be well edited. This one's not the one in the 18-year-old's voice that we don't want another editor. You can get somebody else to look at it and say, I still have a question here, or did you really mean you're so bummed they didn't get to go to prom because they didn't get to go to school? Let's phrase it differently, right? Highlight, use bold, you've got options, but it is important to keep it concise. Can't say that one enough. But hey, you now have not only designed, but documented your homeschool in a way that colleges can understand. I know I see a couple of other friends here who have come and said, wow, this family doesn't have any records and I don't have the time to do this. Can you work with this with the parent, right? Sometimes the parent is the one who needs an IEC. A lot of IECs working directly with students love that interaction. Family interaction when you're homeschooling is part of it, because the parents do have this huge, huge responsibility. And we're hoping that through the book, we've helped them and helped you along as an independent consultant. Amanda, is this one you?
I guess so. Yeah. Wow. Every time both of you speak, I'm just like enraptured by, I have always been in sort of the traditional K-12 environment, and working with the both of you and your expertise, I'm just blown away, really, what you can do in today's educational landscape, right? And all the different programs, and how to really tap into, I think what I took away from this is the tapping into that student experience and how to actually communicate that level of in-depth learning that's happening in these homeschools. And I think because of this new book that you guys have written, that so many families are going to have the tools and the resources to really be able to showcase how amazing their homeschool experience is. So really, I'm just so grateful, one, to know both of you and that you have written this resource. And we really hope that, I think, as the both of you have spent a lot of time and expertise in writing this, that it's going to be a resource, whether you are an IEC working with homeschool families, or whether you are an educator and you are, sort of connected to homeschool families, or you're a homeschool family yourself. So let me, I know there's probably a few questions. The chat was fantastic. It was fun just reading the chat. And a lot of the comments like, oh, I did this and I did this and this is what happened to me. So do we have any questions? Let's kind of bring it up to the authors. Any questions in general about their book or their experience and how they kind of went through the process, or anything in general? And you can unmute yourself too, so don't feel, or you can chat it.
Did you see a comment from Suzanne that I'd like to address a little bit about the grading and how it can feel arbitrary?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, how do you walk that tightrope of knowing there's grade inflation out there, but making, living with yourself ethically and meeting state requirements. So one thing we talk about in the book that we didn't really talk about here is, we're huge fans of rubrics. And sometimes parents don't know how to grade something, like especially art or a poem. Rubrics are your friend. And there's a website we mentioned in the book called Rubistar that will generate rubrics for you. You can tell it what you want. We also tinkered, and our book, we didn't talk about it here, but our book is sort of littered with AI suggestions of how to incorporate this. And AI is actually decent at making a rubric, and with the right prompt. So we give you a prompt example and put that rubric in the book. We also include, I think we skipped the slide, that's my fault, but we also include sort of a checklist of criteria of what might make an honors class. And we give you 6 different characteristics, and we say, if your class hits 3 or 4 of these, feel free to call it an honors class and give it weighting. So we give parents some sort of specific direction there with regard to grades, but certainly happy to answer any other questions people might have.
Well, and I absolutely agree about the arbitrariness. And what some families have found has been super helpful is to take each of those core subjects and find some kind of way to do outside validation of their grades, whether it's a CLEP test, an AP exam, a college class, a tutor, right? It does not have to be a standard accredited kind of institutional assessment tool. But somebody who's not in the family who can speak to, yes, this kid is at this level on this kind of material. And if you've got that across 2, 3, 4 of the core courses, who's going to argue with you? I had one, I was talking to an admissions officer who had read my daughter's transcript and had come to talk to me when we visited the college. And she said, I said, she took it calculus at the community college and got an A. It was easy to give her A's in the other earlier math. And she said, you would be surprised at what we see from some parents, that the institutional grade will be higher from homeschooling parents. The institutional grade will be higher than what the kid they've given them. And they said, we always kind of wonder about that, right? So if you've got that solid evidence in some areas, it can really help give more confidence. Do we have another question?
Yeah, Lisa had a question. Go ahead, Lisa.
Hey, ladies. This book seems amazing. You're hitting so many important topics. What is your recommendation for homeschoolers who are in state A and they're applying 5 or 6 states away to a place that has really different state requirements? And so there's some expectation on the admissions requirement, and they think, what is this thing? I can't get that. My state doesn't have superintendent sign off or homeschool associations that came up in the chat. What's the family's next steps?
Yeah, I talked to a college in New York, high regulation state, who had all these different requirements listed on their site. And I was talking to the admissions, head of admissions, and I said, that doesn't exist in Massachusetts. And sometimes their jaws drop because they're like, it's not all the same everywhere. Yeah, no, it's not all the same everywhere. They're like, well, your students would be coming from Massachusetts. I know Massachusetts homeschooling is usually pretty rigorous. I just tell them to talk to me. Reach out to the admissions office and say, hey, my kid's really interested in your school, but you've got this requirement. That's where we as IECs can be advocating for homeschoolers. Is one place is to remind them or to say, hey, your test optional for everybody except the homeschoolers. Do you know the homeschoolers sometimes have a harder time getting exam seats? Trying to help break down some of those barriers. But you're absolutely right that the requirements, sometimes it's because of misunderstanding, sometimes it's because of local state regulations, can be confusing and can create a barrier. And a student can say, wait, they want me to give a paper that I wrote with handwritten grades by a teacher with my homeschool application? Nobody does that anymore. And that's a barrier. So we try to help break those down and talk to the admissions office. They're people too. They just don't understand necessarily all the stereotypes. or have them.
Well, and Lisa, as you well know, the more times you call a place, the more different answers you may receive on a question. So for the homeschool parents out in the audience, I would say try to get to the right person. If there's a homeschool reader, try to get to that person. And if you can't, then get to the person who reads your region and see what's going on there. Don't take the first answer from the hourly student worker who answers the phone, would be my recommendation. And then secondly, I would love for everyone to realize whether you ever hire an IEC or not, there's probably, I don't know, probably a couple dozen of us nationwide who are homeschool specialists. Plenty of you are on this call, and who hold membership in a professional organization. So please just know, whether you ever hire an IEC or not, we are working on your behalf, because we are doing that sort of education and reaching out to admission officers. And sometimes, because we are not the family, sometimes we can make headway that families can't. That said, there are a couple schools that it is going to be very difficult for a homeschooled student to matriculate to, because they are so stringent in their documentation requirements. But those are astonishingly few. So there is usually a workaround.
Excellent. Any more questions? I know we're at 2 o'clock, but does anybody else have any other questions for the both of them? Great questions. Well, wanted to, again, thank everyone for being here today and listening and seeing how this book could really be influential for all of you, whether it's in your own practice or whether it's in your own home. Again, I know I learned so much on the whole process, and I thought I knew. So one of the things that I know we did in writing the book is kind of thinking about it as sort of a whole curriculum, a comprehensive program. So College UnMazed, Your Guide to Design and Document Your Homeschool, is completely a standalone, fantastic book in of its right, and it is worth every penny in terms of really helping families walk through that process. But we also looked at it as sort of part of that whole curriculum that College UnMazed is about. So we do have it as what we call the Homeschool College Planning in a Box, and it has tons of other resources and other guides, like the guidebook for dual enrollment would be in there, so there are those options as well. So it is a really great comprehensive program. We definitely have, if you have any questions, we have the emails to all of us on here. And since you were here, you listened to this fantastic webinar, if you do use the Homeschool 10 on any of the materials in College UnMazed, you do get automatically 10% off, which is a nice little added bonus for being part of this webinar. But we're super grateful. Thank you, Dr. Avard and Holly. You were both absolutely fantastic today, and so excited for the release of this book. And thank you for all your hard work and working with this population. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Have a fantastic day, and we'll get the recording out. So if you do have a colleague or a family that you work with that would like to have this, please do share this recording with others, even on social media. We would really appreciate it. So thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.